WNST with the Orioles playing every single night. And, of course, Luke Jones will be at Camden Yards through the early part of this week. And then headed into the weekend, we will turn our attention to draft duty all the way around. Thursday night, the Ravens on the clock at 16. This guy has been doing mock drafts, and what the heck else is he going to do? The Pistons and the Red Wings aren't in the playoffs. He's stuck out there in Michigan, and Michigan State aren't even playing anymore. It's all football all the time for Chris Burke at Sports Illustrated. You can follow his journey at Chris Burke_SI. You even got a hockey name, Chris Burke, right? So it's a good time around here to talk a little hockey, but I want to talk football and mock drafts. Who are the Ravens picking, Chris?
Well, I think it's sort of interesting because I think the board could fall to that point where there's not a receiver gone in the first 17 picks. And if that happens, or the first 15 picks, if that happens, I think Baltimore would have to look pretty hard at wide receiver. Mike Williams, certainly Corey Davis, if they trust Corey Davis' health. Those would really be the two names. I guess maybe if O.J. Howard slips that far, I don't think he does. But I think getting another playmaker, if they have a chance, would make a lot of sense for them. It's also kind of a spot where, you definitely could address the pass rush a little bit more. And I think they could use another guy or two there. I think that's going to be where we might see right around that range. We might see a run start on some of those pass rushers. So those are really the two spots. But if Williams and Davis are both still on the board at 16, I think they'd be hard-pressed to pass up both of them.
Well, what's fascinating to me is, and I did not go to the Combine this year, and I know you're a regular in Indianapolis as well. At that time, and we're not going back that far now, it was 6-7 weeks ago, and we were, 8 weeks removed from the actual season and 12 weeks removed from Jimmy Smith playing. I said they got to get a corner. They've got to get a rush edge. That's their need. That's their number one need, having watched them in the season. But it is funny how an offseason comes along, and you pick up a second-hand guy to play for you from the Cowboys. You feel maybe better about Suggs or maybe better about Judon or Zadarius Smith, and you lose Ricky Wagner and you jettison Zuda, and you don't have Steve Smith coming back, and you're 4 more months into the Brashad Perryman experiment. You could start to talk yourself into a right tackle or a lineman or a running back or a wide receiver or even a tight end if it's O.J. Howard, right, Chris? I mean, the needs in November and December become different in the offseason, and then you start to stack the board and say, well, maybe we can get a corner or a rush edge in the second round or the third round because there is more depth there than there is at, say, right tackle.
Right, yeah, and I think that's an interesting point at tackle. If you're looking tackle, and this is not just for the Ravens, this is for probably every team starting with San Diego in the top 10, San Diego and Buffalo. I mean, if you want a guy who could maybe start for you next year, I think you're limited to 3 or 4 guys. I mean, I think Forrest Lamp at this point, people are assuming is going to be a guard. I think if he plays tackle, it would probably be on the left side. So if you want a right side guy, it's Robinson, Ramczyk, Bowles, and Taylor Moton's probably a round 2 guy, but he's someone that I think can start next year. And then after that, there aren't a lot of options. So, like you said, cornerbacks could get driven down the board a bit because there are so many of them. Teams might wait until day 2, day 3, and still get impact guys.
And teams might have their favorites too, right? I mean, with the cornerbacks, after the top 2, there's like 10 guys that have been in the conversation somewhere between, let's say, pick 30 and pick 90, and everybody's going to have their favorite guy based on what they did. There's a lot of differences in sizes in cornerbacks and how you feel about 5'10 cornerbacks and 6'2 cornerbacks, and where they played, quite frankly, and what kind of defensive they played.
Yeah, and I think what you mentioned is important, that just bringing in someone like Brandon Carr. I mean, you want to get to the point heading into the draft. You're not going to have your entire 53-man roster set. You're probably not going to have 22 starters on offense and defense locked in. You want to get to the point where you have that flexibility to go different directions because you would feel okay not addressing certain position in the draft. And I think that's why one of the reasons the Ravens are interesting, because I think they could add a wide receiver, but maybe they feel all right with that group coming up, especially if Perriman takes that next step. And they could draft a right tackle and, on down the line. I think there are spots where they definitely need to get better, but they also don't have a spot where you say, all right, they absolutely have to come out of day 1 with, position X. I don't know that they're necessarily in that boat. So that does open things up for you. I think that opens things up for trade possibilities too, because maybe you slide back 5 or 6 picks, add another selection on day 2, and still get someone who's pretty much the same talent-wise as the guy you would have gotten at 16.
Well, I've been saying that all along. And look, every year I talk about the quarterbacks, whether we're picking at 6 or whether you're picking at 16, how many of those quarterbacks go ahead of you. And I think the running back thing is even more fascinating this year because we've never talked about running backs in the top 15. The last decade and a half, there's been a real movement from the league to get out of using first-round picks on a running back bust, which there have been a lot of in the last 30, 40 years in the NFL. But it feels like these running backs are going to come off the board before the Ravens get there, and not all these guys can get off the board, right? I mean, I've seen 30 different names in mock drafts in the top 16. There's only going to be 15 guys gone if the Ravens make it to 16 and don't trade up to get someone because they have the firepower to be able to do that as well if someone special were to fall. I know last year they would have loved to have had Jalen Ramsey, and that would have taken care of one of their corner positions, but then, what would they be doing at the tackle position? But the Laramie Tunsil thing, I think, created some things last year. Who's to say what's going to happen on Thursday night? But I really do think these quarterbacks become fascinating from a trade standpoint because nobody's really in love with any of them.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think we will see, even though, the Trubisky hype wagon's kind of going right now, but I think we'll see at least 2 quarterbacks in the top 13. 13's that Cardinals pick, and I think we will see Fournette and Christian McCaffrey off the board before the Ravens pick, and O.J. Howard probably, and maybe one of those wide receivers. So you're up 5 or 6 offensive guys, and that's without talking about the possibility of a tackle sneaking up there. And so, yeah, it drives down some of those defensive weapons, certainly. And the Ravens are in that range that's interesting, again, from a trade perspective, because you assume they're not taking quarterback, but they're within reach of a team like the Texans or Chiefs if they wanted to come up and get a quarterback in the middle of that round and get ahead of those other teams, get ahead of Washington even at 17 could be sort of a sleeper for quarterback in round 1. I mean, if they want to go get someone, if Watson starts sliding or Mahomes is still there in the middle of round 1, that suddenly becomes a pretty valuable spot to be holding a draft pick because someone could come up and try to get a quarterback there. So, yeah, I think it's going to be – we do this every year, it seems like. We talk about the quarterbacks, what's going to happen beyond the top 2. Maybe everyone falls, and then teams sort of get desperate the later round 1 goes. And so I still think we're talking about 3 or 4 in the first round at least, and so that does play to the advantage of teams that aren't drafting a quarterback.
He is Chris Burke. You can follow his journey on draft night and all draft weekend. No one covers the NFL better at Sports Illustrated. Tens of thousands of followers. You can join the party of Chris Burke that has the silent E_SI. And, for the rest of these teams in front of the Ravens and for all the 8 or 10 teams that could use a quarterback here, I think it does create, on a pick-by-pick basis, some real drama on Thursday night because I don't think teams are just going to pick chalk. I think there's going to be a lot of moving around and shuffling around. I think that's sort of the way of the draft, and I think that's sort of the moxie of the general managers is for a guy like Ozzie to say, yeah, I'll bang back to 20th and pick up a second round. Sure, I want another good football player, and I think the Ravens sort of started that party in jettisoning Timmy Jernigan 2 weeks ago to pick, to move up one round in the draft to get a little bit more firepower, I think. And obviously Belichick has been doing this for 20 years, although we don't think we're going to hear from him on Thursday night, but we might. You never know.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think it's going to wind up being a pretty crazy draft, and I think it probably will start as early as pick 2 because I still think Myles Garrett's the guy at 1, but if the 49ers do go with a quarterback at 2, that obviously sets a lot of things in motion behind them, and I think they're also a spot where you could see the trades start happening. I think there will be a decent amount of trades because, the chatter right now is that we're not hearing that much about teams maybe wanting to go up, but I think this is sort of how it always happens. Few weeks before the draft, you hear about 20 teams that want to trade back, and teams don't necessarily decide they want to go up until, the pick that they want is staring them in the face there. So I think we'll see a lot of teams look to move. The quarterback certainly could be a reason that they move. Some of these cornerbacks could be a reason that they move. I think we're going to see quite a few trades, and I think probably late in round 1, too, we might see a handful of teams drop out of round one and let Cleveland or San Francisco or Chicago, one of those teams that's early on day two, get back into the round for another pick. So I think it'll be a really interesting first round. I think we know, but at this point it's going to be very unpredictable. It's hard to really nail down anything for any of these teams beyond that first pick from Cleveland, and even that one, depending on who you ask, might still be up for grabs. So I think it's a very interesting draft in that regard.
Chris, you mentioned the craziness around Trubisky, and there's always going to be players that, I've heard the same thing about O.J. Howard. I've heard the same thing about Mike Williams. I know you have Mike Williams mocked to the Ravens. Most mocks don't have him coming anywhere near falling to 16. I guess the hype machine part of this starts to get tiresome, and they've moved the draft back another week now, and they're going to have 250,000 people up in Philadelphia. But at the end of the day, this evaluation process really is about putting on the film, isn't it? I mean, we've heard more Ozzie Newsomes of the league say, the underwear Olympics are nice and the interviewing process and all of that, but we like players who made plays when they were actually on the football field at a high level.
Yeah, I mean, I think the interview process is kind of the X factor and I think that's why there aren't more mock drafts that are accurate and why so much of this is guesswork, because I think the interview process is very important. The medical process is very important. And I think the interview process, especially at the quarterback position, because you can watch on film all you want at that spot, but I think a lot of the quarterback position is, when you get a guy in the room, how does he handle himself and what's he doing when he's up on the whiteboard and all those sorts of things. So there's a lot of mental aspects that's hard to judge on film, and I think that's what these last few months are important for, that mental part and the medical checks, and then obviously you have some guys that hurt themselves by getting in trouble off the field. But, I think at the end of the day, it does come back to the film, and especially if you're deciding between a couple guys on draft night and you're down to the last couple minutes on the clock, you're saying, well, who was the best player? I mean, we're trying to project this out, but if two guys are right there neck and neck and you look back, and I think you do start to look at production and look at maybe even individual games where one guy really took off and played well. So, but it is, it's just every front office does things so differently, and so much of this is happening behind closed doors that's why up till I'm sure 7:59 Thursday night we'll be hearing rumors about teams wanting to move and players rising and falling and all that because everyone's just trying to piece together the information that's out there.
This has been a tough offseason, I think, for the Ravens, not just in, losing a Ricky Wagner and having to give Brandon Williams a lot of money, and that was a great draft pick for them. And, he is a guy you want to have on your franchise and want on your team. The poker has gotten a lot more expensive at that point, but this is really a crucial time and a big 72-hour period of time for Ozzie Newsome, for Eric DeCosta, George Kokinis, for John Harbaugh. 3 out of 4 years they haven't made the playoffs. I don't know what the likelihood or what Vegas would have them at, but I certainly can't sit here and look at them and say, sure, they're going to win 11 or 12 games, unless they have maybe the kind of draft the Dallas Cowboys had, where they find 2 or 3 really good football players at positions that they, quite frankly, need some help in.
Yeah, I mean, I think you and I actually probably have talked about this. Yeah, and